great. How are you, Andy?
I'm not bad at all. Thank you very much for asking. So listen, let's get straight into this. Tell me, how did you end up from Belgium, where you're from, working in Boston, where you are now?
Well, that's a very short question with a very long answer. But I'll touch upon the stages most relevant for your audience, right? So I think my first kind of taste of a wonderful foreign land was actually Ireland. I went on my Erasmus exchange program to Galway. So I was for 6 months actually in beautiful Ireland when I was about 19. And I was like, oh my God, this is so fantastic. People are reading for a degree here. It was so exciting. It's also my first experience with marketing. So I had my very first course in marketing in Galway, taught by a fantastic guy who came from the industry and then went on to become a professor. And so my very first essay in marketing was actually about the psychology of pricing and reference prices. So I really got the bug there. And then so after graduating from my Belgian undergraduate in commercial engineering and then a master's in marketing, I first worked in companies a while. And then I was like, well, I really want to study this more broadly. And I then applied to UCLA for my PhD. So I literally booked a one-way ticket. This was in '97. I went straight from my little town in Belgium to LA. So that was actually quite a shock. But it was right in the beginning of the internet craze. So every month somebody was quitting their PhD to join an internet company and said, come on, Koen, you have to join me. And I was like, no, I'm here for my PhD first. But of course, it did inspire a lot of my research and then further development. And then after UCLA, I went to the Tuck Business School in New Hampshire, Dartmouth College. Mm-hmm. Absolutely fantastic time. Co-teaching with brand gurus like Kevin Keller, learning a lot about how marketing works in the real world, which was really kind of, after my PhD, I really wanted to have an impact and started a lot of consultancy and wonderful time with my students too. And then I had this opportunity to join a startup university in Istanbul. So we packed up all our bags and we moved all the way to Istanbul. So that was just kind of, back in the capital of the old world, as they say. Yeah. And so my exposure to emerging markets, currency fluctuations, things get built very quickly, but they also can get, how would you call that? What annoyed me there was that things also got south very quickly for things completely outside of your control. Yeah. So after Belgium was too boring and Turkey was too exciting, we decided to come back to the US. We always loved New England and we wanted to be in a bigger city. So Boston was the choice. And of course, Northeastern University is the best university in the Northeast. That's why it's called that way. And so we're having a fantastic time here for the last 3 months, 3 years, that we're back.
I really love the mix you've got there of academia and consulting, but also that you've got it across different continents too. So, must give you a really wide world view. I know from my time studying here in the UK and in Ireland, that one of the things that really concerned me or irritated me was how limited some of the reading was. Loads of reading from North America, US, Canada, Britain, Ireland, Australia a little bit as well. That was it. I think the only thing that I ever read or was on a reading list that was not from there was from the Uppsala University about internationalization. So where's all the reading from India? What about China? What about Turkey? What about these supposedly developing nations? I think we need more of that as part of our curriculum.
I completely agree. And maybe one thing I really learned in Turkey was that, so my MBA students from the start, right? So they worked in companies like P&G, Unilever, also very cool local companies, such as Vestel, which produces actually most of the white goods refrigerators and washing machines you actually use in the UK. They just slap a different brand on it. But what I learned is that they were very upset that all of the cases were from the US or the UK. And they didn't specifically demand Turkish cases, even though I did find them and give them. They were happy with cases from Latin America, with cases from other places in Asia, because they just felt that it should be a cultural fit. And so you don't have to have a case of a specific country, but if you have a few cases with countries where the consumer culture is more like them, or the company culture is more like them, they will be so much happier. And there's such a whole world indeed outside of the Anglo-Saxon kind of work style and the consumer culture that we typically teach.
No, I mean, I once spent a month in India traveling. So I was supposed to be on holiday, but my mind always seemed to be in work rather than switching off. But I always found it a really fascinating place, certainly from a marketer's perspective. I think there's maybe couple of hundred official languages there, and yes, everyone speaks English, everyone speaks Hindi, but looking to localize products and looking to sell products in maybe Mumbai, which is very different to Amritsar, which is different to Chennai and Trivandrum in the south, it always felt like a real challenge to me, and I wondered how marketers cope with that.
One of the most fun projects I ever did was comparing how brand strength works differently in emerging versus a mature market. And that was actually the UK and Brazil at the time. But later on, we did it for India, Thailand. And so one of the things we found is that this whole brand love concept, that your brand has to be mysterious and sensual, that completely did not work in the emerging markets that we studied. So what we found, and we'll get to that in a moment, right? But that's something like brand love. When you ask people how much do you love the brand, once you get it in the UK, you get all the people to buy your brand. And this was for deodorants, by the way. So it's something that is pretty low ticket. You know, if I get you to love my new brand, then you probably go out and buy it and give it a try, right? It's like, whether it's Dove for Men or something else. Once I convince you that it's a brand you love, you probably ought to try it. What we saw in an emerging market is that brand love was not really powerful. What was really key was consideration. So when you were advertising a new brand in an emerging market, people they saw the ads. They didn't block them out as much as British people did, fortunately. Mm-hmm. But then they didn't buy. They first had to ask family and friends, is this a brand that I should be using? So there was so much more of this collective forming of the mind about, hey, this is a brand that I would be good at wearing outside the house. It would reflect well on my reputation. And only then, basically, so you had a huge impact of brand consideration on sales. So very key implication for marketers is that in the UK, in this market, you have to get a lot of frequency. You have to touch a person lots of times before they register your ads, but then they will buy. In Brazil, you had to focus on reach. You had to reach a lot of people that could then talk to each other and say, yeah, this is a pretty good brand that we should adopt. And so the implications for marketers are absolutely profound in these cultural differences.
Absolutely. That's the that's the sort of thing I wish we had when I was studying for my master's, and a little bit more background, a bit more international reading. But look, let's come back to academia maybe later on. What I want to talk to you about is why we've invited you here today was is advertising useful? Is it effective? Recently, you may be aware there's a link in the show notes to the Freakonomics podcast. It's a well-respected podcast. It's been going for a long, long time. And fairly recently, they released a two-parter, basically questioning, does advertising work? They did one part on, you might call traditional advertising, and one part on digital advertising. Now, when I was listening to both of them, I was sent them by a number of people, and what little hair I have, I was pulling out because I just couldn't quite really take to the way that they tackled this problem. What was it that I didn't like? First of all, I thought there was some bad extrapolation going on. I thought some of the stuff they used, maybe small sample data sizes or data that maybe is only one industry specific, and then extrapolated it across the whole industry and said advertising doesn't work. So that's a spoiler there for you. The Freakonomics view was advertising didn't work. But I also thought that what they did was it was a bit of a lopsided argument. They had academics coming on with academic research, and then to counterpoint of does advertising work, they got Keith Weed on to tell us a few advertising anecdotes. It felt a bit like marketers had brought a knife to a gunfight, unfortunately. I've seen you talking about this on LinkedIn, which is one of the reasons why I wanted you to come on. So what's your view on the Freakonomics podcast? Do you have a counterpoint? Do you support what they think? Tell us what your view is.
So I was also pulling my hair out, specifically with the first podcast. I like the second one most. And let me get to it, right? So in terms of extrapolation, let me just first tell you what I like. And I start with the second podcast. What I really like, and so Steve Tadeusz, which is kind of key in the second podcast, he's a very respected, and I like him very much as a colleague. So what I like about it is that he says you have to test for yourself. I completely agree with that. So in the marketing world, we take too much after fashions. Just because something worked for one firm or didn't work for one firm doesn't at all mean it won't work for you. And I'll come back in later on, right, to how does this work for small and medium-sized businesses who don't have the resources to do a lot of testing themselves, right? And I see that that's the point. But first of all, I agree with test it for yourself. And I'll give you the example of extrapolation of the second podcast. So Steve Tadelis very nicely describes in very colorful detail his work for eBay, right? So he got hired by eBay. He was asked to kind of vet how a consultancy firm did things. Then said, "Hey, how about I try to do it?" They said no, but then they shut down their paid search for a month. And it was just to show, I think, Bing that they meant it, right? They could do it. And so he had this wonderful opportunity to study what happens when eBay does that. And so, you and your readers know the story. eBay saw virtually no decline in their revenue or even visits to their websites. And of course, it's because when people don't see the paid search ad, they click on the organic search for eBay. And so I mean, yeah, I could have told that from the beginning before you did the research. It's still interesting to show. But here is the important point. When that study came out, it was suddenly generalized to all firms. So the headline was paid search doesn't work. And I'm like, are you guys crazy? And why is this crazy? eBay is an extremely well-known company. eBay is extremely well-known. And by the way, so they look specifically at people already searching for eBay. Of course, if you're searching for eBay, and then you're still clicking on the paid search result, you're just a bit lazy as a consumer. And consumers are lazy. So it was very natural for me that eBay would get these clicks anyway. The consumer just has to jump one more hoop, right? The same thing for products. eBay is extremely well known. The second thing I noticed, and this is me as an academic, right, is that eBay sells what we call search products. eBay sells products that you can basically tell how good they are before you buy them. And so as an academic, I right away think in a 2x2. I'm like, okay, so paid search is not very useful for a well-known company selling easily evaluated products. How about lesser known company? If you're an Irish mid-sized company, right, should you stop your paid search? If you're selling services, should you stop your paid search? So what I did is I got companies in these other three cells, and I basically did the analysis. And lo and behold, if you're a lesser known company, or if you sell harder to evaluate products, including services, then paid search is extremely effective for you. So it depends, right? So just because something is sold for eBay, you shouldn't extrapolate and say, hey, that doesn't work for anybody. We did analyze other well-known companies besides eBay, and we indeed found that kind of paid search was not as effective as managers thought it would be, but it was not zero effective. And I think that's the key.
Yeah, I think, look, I said in a podcast in January that eBay is a punchline to a not particularly funny joke in the industry about how not to do digital advertising. It's just known to be awful. They were talking about their return on advertising spend, their ROAS being for every dollar they spent, they got $1.40 back. I know most companies wouldn't even bother at those rates. They'd be looking for $5, $6, $10, $15 back for every dollar that they spend. So eBay's a bit of a masterclass in how not to do digital advertising, but this was extrapolated. And I just think it was maybe the wrong data.
It's the other thing is, you also shouldn't generalize over online advertising options, right? So just because something doesn't work on Bing on Google, right, or doesn't work on Facebook, it doesn't mean it doesn't work somewhere else. So if you put your product on a site where people not go to for products, they go to look at family and friends, you can expect less sales than if you put it on an online retailer, for instance, where people specifically go to explore new products and buy them. So digital advertising is just too big of a generalization. You can be, and this is one of my other papers, you can be content integrated or content separated. And this is very simple. So content separated is you put your ad on a site where the consumer doesn't go to kind of look in your category, right? So retargeting is an obvious example. So people think retargeting is so crazily effective, right? Because you follow the consumer around very creepily. And so I have looked at something, whether it's a new video game or a pair of shoes, right? And then now I'm checking out the sports results and you retarget me. I'm not on the sports page to check your shoes or your video game. And of course, you're gonna upset lots of consumers. And so time after time, we actually find that retargeting is less effective than a lot of managers think it is. However, if you have a site that say it's a price comparison site for electronics, if you're selling electronics, you are an online retailer, then the consumer is there to learn about products. The consumer is there to compare prices, to compare qualities, to look at reviews. So if you put your ad on that site, it's just way more effective in terms of the whole kind of flow through purchase. And so some of these things are relatively intuitive, and I believe that many managers feel this instinctively. But then they're completely, how would I say this, overwhelmed with all of these free metrics that Google and Facebook give you, right? Oh, how about your engagement? How about how many minutes people watch your YouTube video? And I'm like, but does that matter? Have you have you made the link from these metrics to actually what you care about? And so I find that a lot of companies, unfortunately, didn't make the time to do that. And if you do that, if you think, first of all, what do you want as a company, right? And then you can look at these freely available metrics. And then you can think, well, is there actually some correlation between them? Do they correspond to each other? And once you have established that, you won't be upset so often, right? So, for instance, when Facebook says, oops, we made a mistake, your engagement is only half, right? This actually happened. Or that YouTube says, oh, we kind of miscounted the number of minutes people watch your videos. The companies that I consult, they don't care. I mean, we have made the link with whatever metric there is and their sales. And so, when the company says, oh, sorry, we double counted, your influencers or whatever, we know that, we'll have a certain kind of good prediction of what the sales effect will be. And so any kind of issues like fraud, which is very important, as you know, right? Like double counting, it doesn't really matter to your company if you have a very simple system that says, okay, if this metric increases by 10%, by how much can I expect my sales to increase? And so that's what I've been doing for both smaller and larger companies.
I know one of the things I do when I'm consulting with clients or working with agencies is I say to them, the first metric on your monthly or weekly report or whatever it is has to have a currency sign in front of it. It's the top of the pyramid, right? It's the point we're trying to reach. It's the only thing that people at board level are really interested in. But I think with digital marketers particularly, that we're caught up with so much data that we're drowning in it. And then we start to get focused on some of these data points that don't matter, or some of these data points that make the work we've done look good, but lose sight of the fact that we're actually trying to sell stuff. And we've got the pyramid upside down. We're talking about engagement rates or all sorts of other stuff, but nothing that begins with a currency sign. And I think that's an issue.
Okay, I'll give you a quick example, right? So when I joined Turkey, so this was 2008, I was actually hired by the firm that I was also doing consultancy for in the US before. And so they're one of the big car companies. I won't name which one. They're one of the big ones, but they only had about a 1% market share in Turkey. But they came to me and they say so proudly, but Koen, we have the number one automobile Facebook site in the country. So Turkey is completely Facebook crazy. I think in 2008, it was the third most people on Facebook in absolute number after the US and the UK.
Wow.
So Facebook is very big in Turkey and people really used it and so forth. And they spent 25% of their full marketing budget as the car company on that Facebook page. We do what you guys recommended to us, right? I mean, in the whole 2000s, people have been saying, mostly pundits, consumers spend so much time online, you should spend that much of your marketing budget online. But here is their problem. They didn't sell any more cars. they never got out of their 1% market share. I'm like, okay, without any data, tell me, you have been in this business for decades. What is the number one thing a consumer has to do in Turkey before buying a new car? And they told me.
Test drive?
Test drive, exactly. So have you seen any uptick in your test drives? And they're like, no. So then we run the numbers, right? So then we got numbers and we correlated how many Facebook engagement they had and how many test drives, and there was absolutely no effect. So I said, look, if it doesn't drive your test drives, it's not going to increase your sales. And then you can dig deeper. You say, why is that? Do we have the wrong audience? Are the people kind of happy interacting with our cool site, but they're not the kind of target audience for us? Or is it just that it's not so important in their buying considerations? But you need to have some idea about this one and use your intuition and then see whether whatever you doing actually moves the needle on that?
I think what that shows is that there's so many variables, not just in digital advertising, but in all advertising. And if you look at what they're saying there about test drives, you could change the content, you could change the frequency, the images, the copy. There's so much you could do. But to go back to Freakonomics for a second, what they've said is we've pulled one lever and digital advertising doesn't work. And it's just a bit strange. It's a bit simple. I think maybe rudimentary is probably the kindest way I can describe it.
It is very rudimentary, and I'll tell you something else, right? So this may be a bit of a blasphemy to small companies, but this completely holds for the mid to bigger companies that I actually talked about in the podcast, the anecdotes. Just because advertising doesn't incrementally increase your sales, it doesn't mean it doesn't work. Here is what else advertising does. And this I showed in my paper. Number one, advertising increases your pricing power. And you can quantify that. We have quantified for 350 fast-moving consumer goods that if you advertise more people consider and prefer you. You have lower price sensitivity in the market. And pricing power is absolutely key. I mean, if your industry survives on like 2 or 3% margins, it's even more important. Yeah. But so advertising reduces price sensitivity on consumer. That's number one. Number two, advertising is fantastic to influence investors. So if you are stock market traded, people have shown over and over again that completely controlling for any impact on your sales, your revenues, your profits, investors will put more money in you if you advertise. Wow. Is that irrational? Is that rational? I mean, the debate is out. But advertising does wonders in getting investors aware of your company and actually pouring money in it. And of course, advertising also has effects on getting the best employees to join your firm, your business partners, and co-branding opportunities. These things are a bit harder to quantify. But we have hard numbers that advertisers reducing your price sensitivity and increases your stock price, which really kind of matters to the CEO and the CFO, by the way. So there's so many ways that advertiser can be helpful, even if it doesn't kind of incrementally, physically increase your sales in a certain period.
I think that's a really key thing, which is also a great segue into another question to talk about what Binet and Field call the long and the short of advertising. Advertising has a short-term impact, of course it does, or of course it should do, where you get conversion, bottom of the funnel. You spend X and you get 3X, 5X, or 1.4X, or whatever it is that you get back. But there's also a long-term impact of advertising, and I would posit that I think eBay, yes, if they switched their ads off, it made no difference immediately, but I would say that they would then go into a longer-term decline, where over a certain amount of time, because their trust ratings drop, because they fall out of people's consciousness, they slowly go into a long-term decline by switching that off. So what's your view on that sort of long and short positioning of advertising? Is it a long-term game?
So it is a tougher question. I mean, I'm an empirical guy. I'm an economist by training. So I like to show things in hard metrics. So there's 2 points of view on that one. Number one is that there is a long-term effect, but it shows somewhere in the short term, or at least in short term enough that you can measure it. So typical example, right? So I was involved with 2 wonderful colleagues in an American government basically non-for-profit action to get kids to exercise more. And so it was a bunch of ads that are all based on the verb like jump or run. And so even if we didn't see kind of any, and then we basically had this wonderful survey of the kids and their parents to see how well they exercised more. and so what we saw, which was really interesting, is the advertising campaign made exercising cool again. But some of these kids lived in places where they didn't have the physical opportunity to exercise. There was no playground. There was no gym and so forth. And so what we measured was their change in perception. And then we followed them long term, and so that when they then had the opportunity to exercise, for instance, in the summer or whatever, they would increase more. So one key point, and I do the same thing with brand health metrics, right? So if you do something that is more brand building and you don't expect it to increase your sales in the next 3 months, I'm looking for another metric. I'm looking for something that says, okay, somebody has changed their minds. A consumer has subscribed to your newsletter, right? Or something else. that you can actually measure this. And then ultimately, I like to relate that metric back to sales. I mean, it could be long term, but I want to show specifically for smaller companies that ultimately it does drive your sales. So that's one perspective. That's my perspective. Other people, and I can highly recommend Tim Ambler, right, that wrote this book, Marketing on the Bottom Line, who's London-based. So he says, look, you're building a brand equity, and it's kind of a dam. It's a reservoir of goodwill. So your marketing feeds into this dam with all that wonderful, nice and cool water, and then it's your decision to monetize it or not. Sometimes you just want to let it build. And so in his perspective, these brand health metrics, like trust and so forth, they shouldn't be then later on be forced to translate also into sales. And I see something for that perspective too. There may be things that are so important to you as a company that you say, well, yes, we're going to advertise and we're going to see some movement in some metric, or we're going to maintain trust, as eBay, for example, but we don't require it also to translate into sales in some kind of measurable way.
Okay, so how do we then make that more useful and usable to, say, smaller or medium-sized companies? Maybe companies 50, 100, 150 people, where the person in charge of the business or the person who's running the marketing team maybe isn't a marketer, isn't an economist, perhaps even the marketing team don't have any formal marketing training. So what they're doing is they're looking at the data which they're being given from the platforms, Facebook, Google, wherever, or from their marketing team, which maybe is focusing on those more vanity metrics. What lessons can non-marketers or less experienced marketers take from this?
Yeah. So first of all, and this is the first chapter in my book, in my background here, right? It starts with the vision. What is the vision for your company? And what do you feel you have to accomplish? And I'll give you a typical example, right? So I typically, again, I like to think in 2x2s. So if you believe in the Aaron Bass framework, that your product needs mental and physical availability, or maybe in the more old school metrics, right? Awareness, retail distribution, whatever you call them. Then think about it. What is the biggest blockage right now? And as a small business owner, you know that. You talk to business partners, you talk to retailers trying to convince you to carry your product. And so you know this. You know in your heart that what you really need right now is increasing consumer awareness. You just have to get more consumers to know about your brand. So then you can, for instance, go to retailers online and offline and say, well, you really have to carry it, right? And then once they carry it, goes up. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe consumers really know you well and you have a very loyal following, but the retailers still don't do it. So then you have to do much more on push marketing, right? You have to get much more into convincing retailers that this is the best thing for them to do. And then what I typically do is that I come in and I just quantify these things. And it can be with your own data, it can be with other studies. There's so much publicly available research that shows that on average, in your category, if you double advertising, this is how much more sales you can expect. And so there are very nice benchmarks to use. And so very often we can reason through this with the business experience and some general framework without having any data whatsoever about your company. So once we have data, right, we can say, okay, you should spend more on, let's say, consumer advertising until awareness reaches a certain point, and then you should spend more on push marketing, or the other way around. So it could be this wonderful kind of like your thermostat, right? A closed-loop learning process. Mm-hmm. But you have to start somewhere. You have to come up yourself with the metrics that you think matter most to you at the moment. And then, somebody like me can help you with a more general framework on how to do this. I'll give you one example, right? And this is something typical. So when I came into the Great Recession, right, what we used to call the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, so many companies came to me and said, well, Koen, how should I change my advertising? Because every single person in my industry says I should reduce it. It's a recession. Every single academic says you should increase it, which is true. So every single academic paper you read has all these anecdotes about brands that got, their leader in a recession at some point, and that you should at least maintain your advertising. And I'm like, well, it's really simple, right? The optimal formula is you should spend basically your product contribution margin times your expected sales times your advertising effectiveness. That's a very simple formula. And they said, Koen, but we don't know what our advertising effectiveness is, and we have no data. I'm like, no problem. No data, no problem. So let's just talk about how it will change with the recession. Will you increase your contribution margin? And they're like, no. I mean, we can squeeze our suppliers a bit more, but our customers will even more. So our contribution margin will decrease. I'm like, expected sales will decrease, unless you're selling beer or something that sells well in the crisis, right? Yep. And then how about advertising effectiveness? Will it increase or decrease? And so we work through and this is very simply, right? So if you double your advertising, how much more sales will you get? This can increase in a crisis. 3 conditions. Number 1, because all your competitors cut back, you stand out more. You break through the clutter with the same budget. That's why it's more effective. Number 2, media agencies will charge you less. So one company I was working with was never able to advertise on TV because the bigger brands always outbid it. In the crisis, they could suddenly advertise on TV because the rates had dropped.
Yep.
Number 3, your value proposition, good value for money, is especially appealing during a crisis. So we did that, and we said, okay, in the product categories that you're selling, right? So the rule is, unless your advertising effectiveness increases, you should drop spending in a recession because your margin and your expected sales go down, unless you have a reasonable expectation that you can be more effective with your advertising. And so in some places we increased advertising, in some we decreased it. We didn't have any data whatsoever, no econometric model. So just thinking through the optimal formula to come up with a very good solution.
It's just worth pausing for a second there so we can give a proper plug for your book. If you're listening to that and you're thinking, well, that sounds interesting, and you're rewinding it and playing it again and rewinding it and playing it again, there is a place you can get all of that info in a lot more detail. So tell us about the book that you've written, which I think has a little bit more information about the thought process that goes into what you've just been telling us.
So as you said, this is really written up in all different kinds of businesses, including a lot of small and medium-sized ones across 3 continents that I consulted. And I called it, it's not the size of the data, it's how you use it. But I think that's why it gets stopped in some spam filters. It was a too edgy title. But the subtitle is Smarter Marketing with Analytics and Dashboards. And so that is really kind of, it's a from A to Z strategy about how to think about, how to build kind of a system to look at effectiveness and to improve it, basically. The title is because I wrote it in the beginning of the big data hype. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh my God, people are trying to analyze big data. And in my experience, they don't even make different decisions based on the data that they have now, which is small data. So I'm like, how about, you first start from the basic. You say, okay, which decisions do I need better data for? What is the low-hanging fruit? Especially in a small company, right? Yeah. What am I really confused about? And I'm spending a lot of money. I don't feel I'm getting return. So let me focus on this one and kind of then put the pieces together. And so I talked with lots of anecdotes also, right? So with lots of kind of excerpts about specific companies that I consulted. But I give a really systematic kind of overview from how to go from, the decisions, working backwards to then, how do you maybe get a team together if you want to? How do you use benchmarks that are published and out there for free if you don't have your own data? And of course, how do you make decisions in the face of uncertainty? Because, as you know, marketing is the most toughest challenge of any company. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I always say this whenever I'm teaching in a company, right? The large companies have the finance departments on the budget and so forth. And I'm like, your job is easy. I mean, it's just a little bit of mathematics. I mean, marketing is going out in the real world, right? And trying to kind of get some effectiveness. And it's all based on fickle consumers or customers, on whatever competitors are going to do, which you don't know for sure, whatever the government regulations are going to be. It is way tougher than lots of other things in a company like operations and finance. And so of course, we're not going to have 100% precision. So my refrain in the book is better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And so I want everybody to at least be vaguely right about their marketing spend and how they're thinking about it, instead of kind of following some guru and being precisely wrong about it.
I love it. Absolutely love it. And I'm definitely going to use that. I mean, I tell clients when I'm consulting with them that there isn't such a thing as the perfect amount of data. You've just got to get enough to be comfortable and confident in the decision you're going to make. But you could look forever and keep looking at more data points, and it's just not there. And sometimes that's a hard message to cut through, so I'm definitely going to take your line for that. Anyway, look, tell me this. What about B2B? I often refer to B2B as boring to boring instead of business to business because there's never any personality in it. And I often wonder if advertising's not working in B2B, it's probably the message rather than anything else. But talk me through any case studies you've got in the book or from anywhere else about B2B marketing.
So a lot of the case studies are for B2B marketing. And I'll give you the typical example. And so this was a practice prize finalist. So every other year, the marketing science conference has this kind of finalist of academics who can show in the real world that their stuff made a difference and actually made the company more money. So it's really cool. It's the Gary Lillian Practice Prize, and the videos are all for free of all the finalists of all the years. So it's just really cool to check this out. So the first time I applied, it was basically an 80-person office furniture company. So they basically sell to businesses, to hospitals, and to government buildings, and it's chairs, tables, and so forth. So complete kind of classical business-to-business marketing. One of the big problems that they faced, so they had their marketing actions, is that they didn't have any kind of good insights into repeat purchase of their existing customers. Because the problem is the need for office furniture is only kind of very sporadic, right? So if you grow your business, then you need new office furniture. Or if you're new, but then even if you're extremely happy with me as a supplier, you won't need me until you grow again. So they had a list of their past customers, and then they bought these email and lists of new business and so forth, and they blasted them with direct mail. And there was even overlap between the two lists. So you as a past customer could get both. and they had a low response. They had limited resources, and they're like, well, what on earth can we do? And then this young marketing guy came around, and he said, how about we spend on Google paid search? So Google paid search comes back here, right? And they're like, well, okay, you can have 10% of our budget. And then at the end of the year, they completely spent at the maximum of their budget that they set, right? They went over almost right away, and then Google gave them a nice Christmas gift, and they were Dutch, so we must be overspending on paid search because they could afford to give us a nice Christmas present. So they actually brought me in to show that it's not effective and that their direct mail was fantastic. So we analyzed this in a model, and then, I put this in a dashboard, I played around with it. So lo and behold, what turns out was that the paid search was the most effective strategy. And why is that? Because office furniture is something that people are not typically involved in, right? It's not like cars or sexy things in business to business like private jets or anything like that. You either need it or you don't. It's kind of with consumers and refrigerators. I can send you lots of messages about refrigerators. You won't care until you have a broken down one and you need a new one. Yep. So we actually showed that for their kind of products, and they were not a well-known brand, that paid search was extremely effective. Plus, they had a very good value proposition. They could fit into these 3 sentences that you can put there. And that did. So for them, it was amazingly effective. So then they're like, plus the other thing we showed, which was fascinating. So in business to business, because of the decision-making unit, you would expect marketing to take a longer time to be effective.
Yep.
That was my expectation coming in. That was completely not the case for their business. So people either acted within 2 weeks or they never did. They also sent faxes, by the way. So if you had faxes about office furniture, it was still allowed in the country by that time to cold call people with faxes. You either are like, oh my God, I'm so in the need for office furniture, and people would buy within days, or they would just destroy the fax. So we actually showed that that the effects were within weeks and months instead of years, which we thought before. And then we were able to quantify for that how good it was. So they're like, okay, they were brought in, let's switch everything. So they spent 10% on paid search, 80% on direct mail. They would switch it around. And I'm like, whoa. This is selling the barn based on my model, right? So let's calm down. Let's split your country into 4 similar regions, and let's do the field experiment. So in one, we said, okay, we do the full advice. We increase paid search, we reduce direct mail. In the other one, we just follow one of the two advices. And in the final one, we have the same as before, as usual. So we actually did a field experiment, and you can do that very nicely now, where they could see that, so ultimately it was very effective. They made a lot more money. And the only place where direct mail became effective, so they would lose more money than they put in, right? So if you spend €1 on it, they would get less than €1 back. But it became profitable when they cut it by 50%. So one of the things that we realized, and this was fascinating to hear the managers talk about, is that they had been overdoing it. It was a knee-jerk reaction. Every time they were afraid they wouldn't hit their quota, they would just send more direct mail, because that's what they knew how to do. So the direct mail itself was actually pretty good material, but they had just spent way past the diminishing return phase. And so when they now cut it back, it was effective again and made them money. And so that field experiment, which is way easier to get buy-in from a small company, by the way. A large company is full of politics and departments. And so we were able to really kind of drive the needle. And so there's a few more examples in the book of business to business. I understand and I get why it's taught differently also in my university. I understand what people see. In general, though, I find that consumer and business-to-business marketers can learn a lot from each other. Because I feel that there's a lot of great things in business-to-business that consumer markets have finally gotten, like the importance of relationships and so forth. But there's a lot of cool things in consumer marketing that B2B marketers can also learn from. So I'm very happy to see more of this cross-fertilization over the years.
The big lesson from consumer marketing, from the consumer world, is to treat the buyer as a person. And that's just forgotten in B2B marketing most of the time. It's all about features, and B2B companies just miss out on so much rich content and interesting stuff because they're too busy focused on the product. Talking about nuts and bolts drives me crazy. And that's why I call it boring to boring a lot of the time. Anyway, look, let's move on. Let's talk about education. You're a marketing professor, so I'm going to guess that you're a fan of education. I saw you post on LinkedIn recently, which was about what academics can do to support the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination program. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I mean, in general, right, and this is an issue both in industries and academia, I find that marketers don't get the respect they deserve. So if you do it well, right, I mean, marketing is one of the most intellectually challenging and also rewarding things in business. I mean, it's always changing. You always have to adapt your mind. There's always new instruments that come on. The consumers are changing. The competitor is coming from different places, from overseas. So it's very stimulating, but we typically don't get the respect, whether in a company or in academia, that we deserve. And so I think one of the key things that people that are non-marketers don't understand, besides the fact that it's way more complicated than they think it is that it's actually that the thinking that we do and the concepts we developed are very applicable outside of the typical for-profit market. And so I'm always very inspired. I have a few government and not-for-profit examples in my book too, but I'm very inspired where marketing professors use their insight to do something for the good of society. And so, one of the projects I'm, for instance, very much in right now is studying fake news, right, in elections and how to counteract it and how it affects things, how important it is. Whereas with COVID-19, there was so much wonderful things about, how do you get consumers going? I mean, consumers perceive the threats, they perceive the isolation. How do you talk to consumers and companies to basically do the right thing, for instance? Instead of just thinking about, hey, it's very uncomfortable to wear a mask. I don't want the government to mandate it. And I'm like, fine, but how do we develop a norm that most people do wear a mask? How do we think about vaccination, right? With all of the anti-vaccination agenda, how do we communicate very clearly while telling the truth? And I think this is absolutely important. So I'm a kind of person who would never say that the end justify the means. For me, the means are absolutely important. So if you have to communicate clearly and you have to talk to people, your citizens in this case, as adults and as people who can understand complicated things. So typical example, right? If you believe that masks are important in the beginning of the pandemic, but you also believe that they should be reserved for first responders because they need it most and there's a shortage of match. You should communicate that to consumers. You should not say masks are not good for you. No, you should allow the consumer and the citizen to be an adult and to get relatively kind of two-part sentences, as I call them, right? It doesn't have to be one simple message because people get suspicious, they dig around, and if you're not telling the truth, then it's going to hurt you and your reputation as a government too, just like it hurts you as a company. So how do we get the truth out about the vaccine? How do we counteract fake news, but doing it in a way that, we're talking, from adults to adults and get that through. And so marketing has wonderful things that talk about this, right? So COVID-19 vaccines, we have so much great behavioral science that we can use to that one. And this goes all the way back to anti-tobacco smoking too, right? So one of the first things that I encountered as a PhD student was the revelation from a marketing professor that if you put smoking as a forbidden fruit, if you tell teenagers it's dangerous, you will die, don't do it. Some teenagers are like, fantastic, I like living on the edge. Let's start smoking. Whereas if you make it a tainted fruit, if you say, if you go to Hollywood and say, please don't have your heroes smoke anymore, right? If you make so in your advertising that you focus on things that teenagers care about, such as yellow teeth, not being as attractive to other people, and so forth. Yeah. That's what's effective for teenagers. So this is complete marketing thinking, but it can be applied to anti-tobacco campaigns. It can be applied to COVID-19 communication, lockdowns, vaccines, and I feel that government hasn't really discovered marketing yet. They listen to freaking economists. I mean, come on. Whereas marketing as a profession, right, and also in academia, has so much more different perspectives, has such more balanced views about what makes a human tick, that I really feel that we should kind of broadcast what we do outside of just making money for companies and to get the respect we deserve for that.
I love that is marketing for the greater good, which is driven by the fact that you've got an empirical background as an academic background. So talking about marketing as an industry wider in a bit of a wider context, people come in from a really diverse number of routes into marketing. And I know from my experience, there's people with all sorts of different qualifications and some with no qualifications, some have kind of worked their way through. And I think that's great because it brings a diversity of thought into the profession, which is fine. And I'm not criticizing that. But what we seem to have developed is a derision of formal marketing training, which is most loudly and most vocally by people in the marketing industry. What do you make of that?
So I would say I think that everybody who wants to be an important part in the business should have some sort of formal marketing training. Even if you're in finance, and I do lots of trainings that I have half the finance people, half the marketing people, and that's absolutely brilliant. So I'll give you again a very quick one, and it's based on the same formula, right? So I ask in the beginning of that course, if your advertising is so creative, it's 3 times more effective than before. You have this fantastic new creative advertising, right? Developed by your marketing department, and you can show, and finance agrees, it's 3 times more effective than before. Should you now increase or decrease your marketing spend? What are you feeling, say?
Increase.
Every single marketing in the room says increase. Every single finance person in the room says
decrease, because it's 3 times more effective, so you're selling more for less money.
Exactly. So the finance people are like, oh my God, it's a limited world. I can hit the sales quota for less money. Whereas every marketing person knows, this is the promotion mindset, right? The growth mindset. No, it's a huge world. Right now, I'm 3 times more effective. My consumers will get used to it. My competitors will imitate me. I have this limited window of opportunity that I have to basically capitalize on this one. Now, what I do, and so this is where my economics training comes in, I derive the profit maximizing formula, and I show the finance people that marketing is right. It's completely right. Your optimal spending to make profits for your company depends directly on your advertising effectiveness. So if your advertising gets 3 times more effective, you should triple the advertising budget. And then at the end of the course, they're like, oh yeah, that actually makes sense. And then we go about the reasons why. And we talk about the interesting kind of perspective differences. So this is a long answer to your short question. But I do agree that everybody in a company that has some importance, especially when they control the marketing budget, should know something formally about marketing. And I think what it really adds, it helps you think about what I call all the buckets that are important. When you grow up with a specific experience, you have experience in one sector, in one industry, and from your kind of functional perspective too, right? Maybe you're an engineer and you founded a fantastic company based on the features of your product in business to business. But then when you want the company to grow, you do need to have an idea about, how do companies make the leap from 50 people to 500 people, right? Or from a certain revenue to kind of double or triple the revenue. And you won't get there by just doing what you have been doing before. And so I think in marketing training, yes, it teaches you very concrete stuff, like how to optimize a digital ad campaign. Yes, it teaches you the newest things, but it's a way of thinking that combines economics and psychology, and sometimes sociology, in a very concrete view of a human being related to how people sell and buy. And so I think it's intellectually fascinating for everybody. I think it offers a framework to make sure that you don't forget stuff that is very important, that make your product fail in the marketplace. And it teaches you some very concrete stuff you can use in your day-to-day, if only to better understand the marketers in your company.
Brilliant. I absolutely love that answer. This will be taken, clipped up and used as the show promo, because that is a fantastic answer to that question. Love it. Listen, Koen, I've just seen the time, and so we're coming to the end of the interview, so I need to get to my final two questions. The first one is going to be about what books do you read? I ask everybody who comes on the show what books do they read or podcasts do they listen to and things like that. There's a reading list page on the website if you've never looked at it, which keeps all of the books there, quick references, easy links to go and buy them. So who do you read? Where do you go for marketing insights?
So the first thing to recommend is a very new book, and it's called Smart Marketing.
Okay.
By Dan White. And this is related to what we just talked about. It's just amazing. So I give it to companies, to all the people also without a marketing background. So the Dan White's book, it's all visuals. So it's a normal size book, but you read it very quickly because he has this wonderful talent to visualize important marketing concepts.
Okay.
And when I was reading through it, I'm like, oh my God. And it's all correct too, which kind of surprised me for such a book. So it's based on actual marketing knowledge. As an academic, I can endorse, but it's so much simpler than how I write stuff. So let me just put it that way. So I would first read this book called Smart Marketing. And only then I would read my book, which is called Smarter Marketing. So maybe
you're a step above.
It's called Smartest, yes. And we will read that one. So I like Smart Marketing, very visual, very easy to understand. And I also give it to my non-marketer kind of important decision makers in the company. So my advisor is called Mike Hansens, wonderful Belgian guy who moved to the States in the 70s. And so he has this wonderful book called Empirical Generalizations. And this is by the Marketing Science Institute. It's a very small book. And so every page is just, what do we know about the effectiveness of Salesforce, of display? What do we know about the long-term effect? Is it twice the short-term effect? So he has distilled all of the studies that we have done, hundreds of studies in academia, and come up with concrete numbers that are very useful as benchmarks. And we, as econometricians, we call that empirical generalization. So we could call it the laws of marketing, but because we're not physicists, we call it, what on average you can expect. That's basically it.
So the physicists were better at naming books than the marketers. That's one of the key takeaways from this podcast.
So I always find that, specifically in academia, marketers can't market themselves. That's why they need help. And so an old dean of me said, well, everybody researches what I don't understand. This was literally true. In 2001, when I joined, the dean was like, look, my finance faculty are all bankrupt because they followed their own advice on the stock market, right, with the dot-com bust. My marketing faculty can't market themselves. And my team and organizational behavior faculty can't get along with each other. So obviously, I think marketers should do a better job marketing themselves. You're completely right.
Brilliant. That sounds like a great school to work at. Oh, great. So look,
so maybe just a few more, right? I like Jonah Berger's book, like Contagious, and his new book. So anything kind kind of to really understand the process. But I'll stop there.
That's brilliant. That's great. And do look, if you have any other recommendations, do fire them over to me in an email or whatever. And everything that Koen's just mentioned will be in the show notes. So just have a look around wherever you're listening, watching, and you'll be able to find an easy click link there. So now down to my last question. I ask everybody the same thing. What one question were you expecting me to ask that I haven't asked yet?
So for me, it was kind of really how to pronounce my name, and you did a great job. So when I was joining Tuck, this is 2001, right? So my name is pronounced Koen Pauwels. I'm a Dutch-speaking Belgian, but they thought that Koen Pauwels was joining them. Koen Pauwels, and it's close. And so you can imagine, and in 2001 especially, right? I mean, he's always fantastic, but everybody knew him at that time. So when I showed up, they were a bit surprised and disappointed.
I can see the problem, because I look a bit more like Colin Powell than you do. Oh, brilliant. I can see the problem. So, listen, Koen, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and really, really enjoyed the interview. The data background to it, the empirical evidence, but also the stories of people you've worked with. I think it's been fantastic. You are the first academic on the show for my sins. We will have more academics on in the future, I promise. And I think it's really interesting for people to hear the different sides and the important things that you find in marketing as well. So thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on the show.
This is a great service to the community, Andy, and thanks so much for having me on this podcast.
The pleasure is all mine. Right. Well, that's it. We are out. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please do find us on your podcasting place of choice. If you can rate it 5-star, that would be wonderful. Thank you. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button. Please subscribe. And please do pass this on to someone. If you like what you hear, it would be great if you could share it with a friend and who's in marketing, who's not in marketing, whatever. Send it on to them and go, have a listen to this podcast, tell us what you think. If you don't like it, tell me what you think. Please do, because I'm sat here in a room talking to myself most of the time, or talking to a guest via Zoom. So I'd like to hear what you think. You'll find me on Twitter. I am at Andy Jarvis. That's Andy with an I, ANDI Jarvis. Come back. The strategy sessions will be here again in 2 weeks, every fortnight with a new episode. So please do subscribe, and I'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.